building that's been described as being a vertical, informal settlement. Nosipho Hlatshwayo is the executive manager for programs at the SA Cities Network. Nosipho, thank you for your time. Good afternoon to you. There are so many buildings like this in Joburg, in other cities too. Do cities have a duty to provide affordable housing for people in metros like Joburg? Ma'am, I'm just going to ask you to...
Good afternoon.
We can hear you now. Go for it.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes. Yes, cities do have a duty to provide housing, but so does the private sector. The Constitution speaks of access to adequate housing. It doesn't then prescribe from whom that housing should come from, but the state certainly has got a duty to do that, and it does that in many forms. One that we are very familiar with is the provision of what used to be called the RDP housing, which is one house in one single stand. But in city centers as well, we find public investment in social housing, which is a block of flats which are managed and run by organizations such as the Joburg social housing company. And then the private sector as well does play a role in making sure that the missing middle, or there's that gap market, also has access to housing. So it's a range of actors who are responding to a big problem that is contributed to by political, social, and some of the environmental factors that South Africa and many other developing countries are dealing with.
I'm going to come to those in a moment, but first, if we can just define what we're talking about. What is affordable housing? How much would it cost? Would it be for a family? How big would that family be? Is there a definition of affordable housing?
So maybe let's start by talking about housing as a need and housing as a demand and differentiate that. Then we can talk about affordability. When we talk about housing need, we're talking about people needing shelter, access to adequate shelter. And when we say adequate shelter, there are definitions there. You can say that it's a house that doesn't leak, that has got access to services. It could be made of brick and mortar or other materials, but it's just decent shelter, right? And we say that there is a need for that. And then when we talk about the demand for housing, we're talking about a need for housing. There's a particular market of people that need houses, that would buy houses, but they can't have access to it because the supply does not meet the demand. Now, you are asking a question your question around affordable housing. Affordability depends on which segment of the housing market you fall in, right? So if we are talking about somebody that is purely depending on state assistance, or even if they are working, they are on perpetual temporary work, those people will probably qualify for housing that is subsidized by the state. And then on the other hand, you have people who are working in employment, but their salaries are not enough to cover them to get like a bond from the bank. And that's where also the state intervenes through this gap market program that they are running for the first time buyers to access housing. So this whole issue of affordability depends on where you sit on the access to income in the world.
This particular building, and there's a sort of very South African history to this building, a very difficult history to this building. News 24, and I think maybe others are reporting this afternoon that it was first built, and I can't quite believe this, as a building to provide passes for black people coming into the city of Joburg in the 1950s. It was essentially a pass office. Then became an office that was used to provide services for people. All through this time, as I understand it, it's been the property of the state. Currently owned by the Joburg Property Company, and obviously there might be other parts to its history. But it then became hijacked. So this is a state-owned building that the city lost control of, and it won't be the other building like this. How does that actually happen? How does a building that is owned by government end up in this state?
Stephen, I don't have the details around how this particular building was hijacked. But I would also assume that, as with other buildings that are getting hijacked in other cities, and maybe more pronounced in the city of Johannesburg, it is that contestation between if people are evicted from a property that is privately owned, and I would say here in the case of the city, property is privately owned. When they are evicted, in terms of our constitution, there are things that you can and cannot do. So if they've been in your property for longer than a particular period, if you are to evict them, you need to provide them with alternative accommodation. Now, as I said, in this instance, I don't know whether that is the case, but if it is the case, it will not be surprising, because then it would have meant that the city, when they needed to evict the occupants of the building, then they would have needed to provide them alternative accommodation. And at the same time, the very same city is dealing with people that are in informal settlements, and this housing need grows day by day with the number of people that are coming into the city and the economy not growing. People whom some of them did have housing are losing their houses and they're finding themselves on the street. So it's very complex, and it does require us to really maybe do a little bit of investigation of what really happened so that we understand how it got hijacked.
So there are many buildings like this, as you say, and they'll all have their own stories and they'll have similar patterns as well. I mean, it's very difficult. So you've got the law on the one side, you've got a group of people who need accommodation, and more people, as you say, who need accommodation. Are cities almost just throwing their hands up and saying, I can't deal with this, and leaving it, ignoring the problem and hoping it'll go away, when I suppose what they should be doing is trying to solve it, as complex as it may be?
First of all, the role of providing adequate housing does not only fall with the cities. So it is, in some cities, it's a responsibility that they are carrying on behalf of the National Department of Human Settlements. For cities to provide affordable housing, they get money, they get grants from the department itself, and if it is social housing, that money gets channeled through the social housing agency, the National Social Housing Agency. So we cannot say that cities alone, and we cannot say that just providing a house or accommodation is as easy as saying give the city money, then they'll build a house. We do need to dig a little bit deeper and say, why are people not affording to have their own accommodation? Beyond just saying, why do we have so many people coming into the cities? People cannot afford housing, even if the private sector was to invest and provide housing. Let's say, even if it was 3,500 rand a month, we will still have this problem, because one, we're not creating enough jobs. Our economy is not creating enough jobs for people to afford some of the decent services and shelter that they need. So the whole thing around the socio-political economy of housing and housing provision is something that we need to talk to, recognizing that while cities are doing this, there are other actors in the space who are mandated to do this work, and it's something that we all need to be mindful of.
I realize, Nosipho, we're in the sort of period of the story when there's a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, a lot of heartbreak, and a lot of frustration. And so I'll be quite careful with what I say, but it seems to me that perhaps there's maybe been a complete failure of governance, a failure of governance by the city of Joburg, by the province of Gauteng, and by the government of the Republic of South Africa. Would that be fair?
Context once again here, and as I said, that I do not fully have the details around what did happen, and maybe to allow the city to further unpack what happened, and other independent bodies to tell us what happened. But the truth of the matter is, cities in South Africa have got a long way to go if they are to deal with issues of informality, be it informality in terms of shacks that get erected in open fields, or invasion of buildings that are either dilapidated or buildings that are abandoned. What this then calls for cities is maybe a different approach, or paying a little bit attention to the management of the public realm. because in some instances, some buildings get hijacked because of bylaw enforcement. When a building has been shut down because it doesn't abide to bylaws, we still find instances where people will then break those chains that your bylaw officers would put up, still inhabit those buildings, even if the building doesn't have water, even if the building doesn't have sanitation services and the likes. So the softer things that we don't often talk about, which are bylaw enforcement, especially in the public realm, are things that cities would need to deal with. But these things also, they cost money, and they require the city to really make a decision and say the city has zero tolerance to lawlessness as it relates to our public spaces, and invest as such to make sure that these are curbed.
Nosipho Hlatshwayo, thank you. Executive Manager for Programs at the SA Cities Network. Really do appreciate the time. Well,